Hey there, I am glad you're back. It has been 4 years since my grandfather passed away. A war veteran who carried the aura of what a war veteran is supposed to be. Today's episode is linked directly to our cultures and the land itself. Real or myth, it is for you to decide. Today's episode is special, so listen carefully. The boy's name was Ali. 7 years old, scarf tied tight around his mouth, feet wrapped in old wool and plastic, and he was already smarter than half the adults in that village. He knew better than to yell in the forest. That's how things found you. But his family's 3 goats hadn't come back the night before, and his mother was already praying too hard, which meant his father had either passed away or wasn't taking the prime role in the family. He walked slow along the tree line, frost crunching underfoot, the sun just beginning to hit the slope of the mountain. What rang in his head was the repeated warnings from the old man who lived nearby his house. The forest isn't safe anymore, things have returned. It was quiet. No birds or dog barks, just the creaking breath of trees under ice and the distant whisper of running water under snow. Ali proceeded with caution. He was reluctant, yet he knew what was to be done. For losing goats meant losing some parts of their livelihood. Something caught his eyes, hoofprints. Still fresh, and that brought some excitement. The goats should be near. He followed them. What he found at the edge of the tree line, near the frozen stream, was a drag mark, wide as his shoulders. The snow was stained pink. It wasn't fresh blood. Old blood that had frozen, thawed, and frozen again. And all at once, Ali turned around and ran. 3 days later, a drone from an Indian defense outpost caught something unusual, a heat bloom beneath the central lake in Sonamarg. Perfectly circular and too steady to be a natural spring, it was warm as well. At that altitude, even warm-blooded animals don't radiate that much from under 10 feet of ice. The locals had already been reporting cattle vanishing. One man claimed he saw a naked red giant walk into the lake and disappear. They laughed at him, called it post-COVID delirium due to the vaccination shots. Half the village still wore masks when they went to mosque. The other half pretended the virus was a rumor designed by Delhi. Nobody wanted to talk about the missing shepherds, or the sound of something drumming beneath the mountain during lockdown. December 16, 2020. Temperature, -12 degrees Celsius. Snow depth, 7 feet. Visibility was low. A 6-man reconnaissance team was dispatched unofficially. 3 ex-special forces, 1 Himalayan terrain medic, a young interpreter named Tariq, and a cryptid specialist out of Gujarat, a man known only as Rana, ex-military. Rumor was he once tracked something through the Jim Corbett National Park that killed 3 tiger poachers and left the heads in a tree. They arrived by heli-drop, snow came sideways, and the wind was on the higher end. First hour, nothing. Second hour, snowshoe tracks, abandoned. Third hour, a yak corpse, half-eaten at the neck like someone tried to unscrew it. Its legs were bent backwards, stomach torn open, but not eaten. The snow around it was red. Not just stained, red and melted, like the body had bled heat. Rana knelt beside it. "This isn't wolves," he said. "And this isn't fresh. Whatever did this, it's not killing to eat." The commander gave the order to move up the ridge and make camp by sunset. Visibility was dropping. A storm was closing in. The campfire cracked. Reluctant fire burned as the cold air was getting intense, as serene and wild as it could be. Pine trees, thick snow, and a fire. The tent fabric whined against the wind like a dying violin. Snow kept falling sideways. The smell of burned instant dough floated out of a battered aluminum pot, half-heated over a sputtering camp stove. No one was really eating. They continued to stir the pot. Sergeant Harjot Man sat with his back to the fire, eyes always on the tree-line like the soldier he'd always been, even before that piece of metal tore through his neck outside Kupvara in 2016. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice rasped like an old radio trying to tune in something it wasn't sure it wanted to hear. Corporal Chowdhury, Chow, to everyone who liked him, was the youngest, barely 24, and probably the only one still thinking this was some covert recon mission and not another classified write-off. He kept cracking jokes nobody laughed at, and wore his scarf with Bollywood flair, like the cold was an inconvenience. The medic, Parth Deshmukh, a lean man with sunken cheeks and calloused fingers, had served with MSF in Syria before the bureaucracy swallowed him. He was one of those rare types who could stitch you up, calm you down, and scare the hell out of you, all in the same breath. He carried his kit like a holy book. Rana, the cryptid man, barely spoke except when something didn't make sense, which was often. Mid-40s, silver in his hair, eyes too calm for comfort. The sort of calm you find in surgeons and snipers. When asked what he studied, he simply said, "Patterns in myth and muscle." He didn't smile, didn't blink much, and had an old burn scar on his left palm shaped like a snake swallowing its own tail. Tariq was the interpreter, barely 19, borrowed from a local intelligence unit. Tall, bookish, wore thick glasses that kept fogging up. He tried to keep pace with the soldiers, but his boots were too loose and his hands shook too often. His uncle was from Sonamarg, which made him both an asset and, quietly, a liability. He'd already admitted he hadn't visited this part of the valley since he was 10, and even back then, they never went out after dark. That night, before the frost turned the fire into a memory, an old man walked into the camp. No one saw him approach. One moment the snow was empty. The next, there he was, wrapped in layers of wool and silence, eyes fogged with age, and his presence was heavier. Tariq froze, Harjat stood and reached for his rifle, but Rana shook his head once. The man was no threat to them. They sat him down by the fire, handed him a steaming cup of salt tea, and asked him what he wanted. He didn't drink, just held the cup. Then he spoke, quiet, like a priest in a broken temple. "You call this place Sonamarg, but that name is for the postcards. For the tourists, this valley, it was once Burzil, the gate of the bound ones. That lake, what you see on your map, it is not a lake. It is a seal, and you have cracked it with your firebirds and ground drills and foreign machines. This winter, the lake has wept. That is why your goats are gone. That is why the ground is warm beneath the snow." No one said a word. Chow cleared his throat, then chuckled awkwardly. "He's talking about some Yeti, yeah? Or the tall men bullshit?" The old man turned his face to him. Slowly, like ice breaking. "Yeti are children. These are older. In the oldest books, they were not called monsters. They were kings, Burzil, the Red Walkers." Harjat lit a cigarette and said nothing. Parth took notes without looking up. Rana stared into the fire. Then the old man reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in goat leather. He unrolled it on the snow. A 6-fingered handprint, pressed into fossilized clay, perfectly preserved. The thumb sat low, the fingers long. And the scale of it was inhuman. Each finger thicker than a broom handle. A hand that could crush a grown man's chest like wrapping paper. Rana gently picked it up, weighed it in his gloved hand, and said, almost to himself, "This isn't tribal. This isn't decorative. This is a cast." Chow finally stopped smiling. The old man stood, left the tea untouched, and whispered just before vanishing into the dark, "You still have time, run for your dear lives." The clouds had thickened and the air had taken on the texture of wet steel, thin but full of weight, as if pressure itself had secrets. There wasn't much talking that morning. Everyone felt it. The night had been too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. Rana had been staring at the terrain tablet for half an hour, eyes locked on a topographical dent near the northeast ridge. He didn't need to say it. Harjat already knew. Rana had seen something last night, and this wasn't just a satellite anomaly. It was personal. "We move east. Rana finally said, rolling up the thermal pad and adjusting the strap on his pack. Chow raised an eyebrow. That's avalanche country. Rana looked at him without smiling. Not recently. No one argued. They trusted Rana, not because he talked much, but because he never talked unless he knew something for certain. 2 hours into the climb, with wind clawing at their necks and their breath freezing in strings before falling, they found it. Not with a loud revelation, but with the kind of creeping certainty that starts in your spine and works outward. Half buried beneath an outcrop of fractured granite was a steel hatch, bent inward as if crushed by time or something stronger. The snow atop it hadn't melted. It had been brushed aside, not recently, but in a way that suggested maintenance. The team approached slowly, weapons drawn, boots pressing down into years of untouched frost. There were no markings at first, but Parth noticed the soil pattern. A line of disturbed earth, very old, running toward the cliff wall. He wiped away the snow and found the edge of a rusted panel. Then another. Rana knelt, gloved hand on metal. It's not a bunker, he said. It's a listening post. But bigger. Harjot tapped the side. You've seen this before? Rana hesitated, then nodded. I was briefed once. During my SFF days. Indo-Soviet intel share. Classified stuff back when our two governments were playing Frankenstein together. Biological weapon research. Most of it was garbage. But some was not. They called it Burzil Complex. Chow muttered, cool name for a haunted basement. They tried to force the hatch. It didn't budge. 2 hours into the climb, with wind clawing at their necks and their breath freezing in strings before falling, they found it. Not with a loud revelation, but with the kind of creeping certainty that starts in your spine and works outward. Half buried beneath an outcrop of fractured granite was a steel hatch, bent inward as if crushed by time or something stronger. The snow atop it hadn't melted. It had been brushed aside, not recently, but in a way that suggested maintenance. The team approached slowly, weapons drawn, boots pressing down into years of untouched frost. There were no markings at first, but Parth noticed the soil pattern. A line of disturbed earth, very old, running toward the cliff wall. He wiped away the snow and found the edge of a rusted panel. Then another. Rana knelt, gloved hand on metal. It's not a bunker, he said. It's a listening post. But bigger. Harjot tapped the side. You've seen this before? Rana hesitated, then nodded. I was briefed once. During my SFF days. Indo-Soviet intel share. Classified stuff back when our two governments were playing Frankenstein together. Biological weapon research. Most of it was garbage. But some was not. They called it Burzil Complex. Chow muttered, cool name for a haunted basement. They tried to force the hatch. It didn't budge. That's when Harjot ordered the detonation. 2 charges, surgically placed. The kind they use for mountain doors in enemy tunnels. Enough to open, not collapse. The boom was sharp, short, and thunderless. The snow swallowed the sound like it owed a debt. The hatch blew open, steam and powdered frost curling up like breath from a buried throat. Flashlights on, weapons up. The corridor inside was narrow, metallic, ribbed like a submarine spine. Decades of snowmelt had seeped in, but the structure held. Soviet engineering didn't mess around. Old emergency lights hung dead on the walls. Frost-covered wires dangled like vines. Warning labels in Cyrillic and faded Russian papered the threshold. Inside the central atrium, the air was dense, not with mold, but with something drier, thinner, like whatever had once breathed here hadn't used oxygen the same way humans did. The team fanned out. The first room they entered was a mess of collapsed storage racks and overturned desks. Medical files frozen inside plastic sleeves. A shattered photo frame still clutched in skeletal fingers. The photo showed 3 scientists in heavy winter coats standing beside something that was blurred on purpose. Parth opened the next room. Inside was what looked like a sarcophagus, except it was made of stainless steel, bolted into the floor, its lid half open. Lining the room, bones. Not massive femurs, twisted vertebrae, rib cages the size of bathtubs. Some of them were encased in hardened resin, tagged with yellowed serials in Russian and red stamps reading BIE Salta. The crown jewel was pinned to the far wall. A set of claws, curved inward, still attached to a partial forearm. 8 fingers, each one ending in a blade-like growth. Harjot exhaled sharply. They weren't studying it, Rana whispered. Looks they were sculpting weapons. They made camp in the largest chamber, one once used as a lab or debriefing station, now reclaimed by cold and dust. They set up a portable heater, sealed 2 doors with climbing ropes and pitons, and placed tripwires around the open hatch. The storm outside had grown worse. It howled through the corridors now, weaving with the exposed ducts like an old voice trying to remember how to scream. Dinner was dry biscuits, boiled snow, and tinned goat meat that tasted like old copper. Parth found a stack of Soviet comics under one of the desks, propaganda fluff. One showed a cartoon soldier punching a Yeti. Can't make this shit up, Chow said, flipping through it. Whoever drew this definitely saw something. Yeah, Harjot replied, rubbing his temples, and whoever survived didn't go back to art school. They laughed from something closer to defiance. Later that night, as Parth dozed off, he muttered, "You think the Soviets buried these giants because they were afraid?" Rana, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, responded slowly. They buried them because they thought they could use them. Chow, half asleep with a biscuit in his mouth, added, "Imagine the UN briefing when one of these bastards gets loose. Sir, we lost contact with the Himalayas." The storm outside never grown by nightfall, a howling, biting tempest that came down from the ridge. Snow slashed sideways in blades, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Harjot called it. They would stay the night in the Burzil complex, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. Outside was no longer wilderness, it was hostile geography. They reinforced the steel door they'd blown open with climbing rope, bolts, and an avalanche shovel wedged into a hinge. The wind still shrieked, but the cold held back just enough inside the buried complex. It was strange, almost like the ruin was glad to have them again. Like it remembered boots and blood. Parth and Chow had set up the heat lamp, which buzzed like an old insect, barely pushing back the chill. Rana stood in one of the corners, his eyes scanning old Soviet markings like they were prophecies he'd forgotten to memorize. And that's when Rana found the file canisters. Dust-covered, brittle, yellowed paper. They huddled under the heat lamp and began reading in silence. The files were fragmented, translated barely, some handwritten in panicked ink. But the message was clear. The Soviets had been tracking giant humanoid entities across the Central Asian ranges since the 1950s. They were referred to as blood men. Specimens observed over 12 feet tall. Armored in bone, sometimes seen standing perfectly still in the distance. Other time appearing in places they should not have reached on foot. But the kicker, the detail that changed everything, was found on a page marked 1979, Kandahar. Rana translated out loud. U.S. reconnaissance team in Afghanistan encountered hostile entity, described as red-haired, giant humanoid, barefoot, armed with crude metal spear. Entity killed multiple personnel before being brought down by concentrated rifle fire. Body disappeared before retrieval. File flagged unverifiable. Local tribes refer to entity as Nephilim. Chow looked up, eyebrows raised. That's that Kandahar story, right? Some SEAL team getting torn up by a mountain ogre. Harjot didn't answer. He just stared at the report. Because it didn't end there. The file continued. DNA samples analyzed in cross-reference with Burzil specimen recovered in 1965. 93% match. Global spread suspected. Himalayan basin may host dormant cluster. The file was stamped. Top secret / never deploy without final clearance / hostile entities may be interconnected across regions. Rana closed the folder and said nothing for a long time. Then he leaned forward. This wasn't a one-off. The giant of Kandahar wasn't alone. It was one of many. And at some point, either the Soviet or someone before them tried to bury them here. Parth looked back at the corridor lined with bone racks and shattered containment cages. Guess contain should be perfect word or maybe weaponize. Their silence was broken only by the ticking of an old Soviet clock that hadn't moved in decades. The storm screamed louder outside. The pipes groaned overhead like something massive had stirred inside the walls. And so, resigned to an uneasy night indoors, they set up sleeping bags near the lamp and unrolled thermal mats along the steel floor. Someone opened a flask. Someone else lit a candle that barely helped. That's when Chow clapped his hands. "All right, boys, new game, one at a time, tell us what you're packing." "Not emotionally, I already know we're all damaged. I mean gear, guns, the essentials." Parth, tightening his gloves, sighed. "Chow, is now really the time?" But Chow was already grinning. "Come on, we're freezing our balls off, and there's probably a 10-foot Yeti ghost watching us from the ductwork, humor me." Harjot didn't even lift his head. "You first, Joker." Chow stood theatrically and unshouldered his rifle, holding it up like it was a baby being baptized. This beauty, Trishy assault rifle, lightweight, vicious, and probably illegal in 6 countries if you attach the wrong magazine. I call her Radha because she sings when she's angry. He jingled a tiny Krishna keychain dangling from the trigger guard. Divine partnership keeps the bullets holy. Or at least directionally accurate. Tariq blinked. "That's not how ballistics works." Chow shot him a look. "It is in my religion, Professor." Parth laughed softly. "You're going to shoot a monster and pray it finds enlightenment before it eats you." "Damn right, you bastard," Chow said. "Your turn, document." Parth unslung his pack with the weariness of a man who's seen too much bleeding. Glock 17, nothing fancy, stainless, reliable, shoots where I point it. Also got my trauma kit here. 4 packs, adrenaline syringes, quick clot, fentanyl if one of you turns into a human ketchup bottle, and salt packets in case the thing that kills you also happens to be demonic. Chow looked impressed. "All that fits in that tiny satchel?" Parth smirked. "I learned how to pack in Aleppo, under mortar fire. Try fitting a surgical kit, antibiotics, and morphine into a lunchbox while your tent's on fire." Harjot finally leaned into the firelight, adjusting the strap of his Insa's rifle, its blackened frame gleaming with frost and memory. Modified barrel, silencer, thermal optics, custom stock. He paused, tapping a finger along the side. Scratched into the rifle, almost lovingly, was the name Yin. Tariq asked quietly, "Your son?" Harjot stared into the flames like they owed him something. "My spotter, Kuba 2016, took a round meant for me." That shut everyone up for a moment. Then Chow clapped once. "All right, heavy deep next." All heads turned to Rana, who, until now, had been sitting cross-legged beside the fire, silent, almost statuesque, weapons sharp in his arms, but it was the blade that caught all their attention, his kukri across his knees like it had its own presence. He looked up slowly. Then, without a word, unsheathed it. The blade whispered against the leather, and the firelight caught on its surface like it was made of moonlight and old blood. Silver etching ran down both sides. Intricate patterns of serpents, fire, and mountains, not of any regiment or known religion. Chow whistled. "Damn, that's not army issue." "It's actually older," Rana said softly. "Passed down from my grandfather's grandfather." They say it was used in the Khyber Pass. Against men who weren't men. Raiders who walked on 2 legs but had the strength of 4. This blade right here, he held it up, reverently, was not made for hunting. It was made for ending curses. Tariq leaned in. That etching, what does it mean? Rana traced a finger along the symbols. It tells a story. A warrior who cut down a demon that wore a human's face. But before it died, it spat into the blade and said, "You'll never be rid of me. Every time you cut, I'll return." And so the blade was passed down, not to use, but to remember. Only draw it when you're sure you're not cutting shadows. Harjot raised a brow. So you brought a family heirloom to fight snow giants? Rana sheathed the kukri in one fluid motion. If it bleeds, it remembers the blade. Chow laughed. You talk like a cursed monk in an action movie. And you talk like a man who's going to shoot a holy creature in the ass and get cursed. They all laughed then, low, tired, but real. The kind of laughter that happens when men are terrified and need to pretend they aren't. The fire popped. Someone passed around a flask of spiced rum. Tariq relaxed just a little. It was strange how quickly sleep took the rest though. One by one, the fire's orange crackle seemed to lull each man into a silent drift, as if the steel and frost-lined corridors of the Burzil complex had exhaled something older than air, something comforting in a sickly way. The kind of sleep that came in beautifully, without even dreams. It simply folded over them like a blanket laced with old anesthesia. Except Rana lay there still, eyes open, not blinking, his back pressed against the corrugated wall and his kukri across his chest like a relic that remembered things even he had tried to forget. He didn't sleep easily these days. Hadn't in years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since the Syrian Ridge. And especially not in structures that once held bones labeled by men who thought they could label gods. He watched them as they dozed, Parth with his arms crossed tight like he was warding off ghosts, Chow snoring lightly, muttering fragments of song lyrics, and Harjot with his rifle resting against his shoulder, his breathing quiet but his brow furrowed like war had followed him even here. Rana didn't sleep that night. Not because he wasn't tired, he was exhausted to the marrow from the trek, from the tension, from the memories clawing at the back of his mind like starving animals in a cage, but because sleep, at this point in his life, felt more like surrender than rest. And surrender was not something Rana ever did lightly. The fire had faded to embers, flickering and curling shadows up the rusted Soviet walls of the chamber, casting the outlines of his sleeping team like crude cave paintings left behind for another generation to decipher. Chow had rolled onto his back and mumbled something about gulab jamuns and demons. Parth lay still, chest slowly rising and falling, the corner of his trauma kit still gripped in one gloved hand like a prayer. Even Harjot, always stiff-backed and alert, had finally slumped against the wall, his modified Insa's rifle resting beside him like an old dog curled at its master's feet. Rana waited another 10 minutes. 20. Until the breathing grew rhythmic and the silence settled again like ancient dust on forgotten bones. Then he got to his feet. The kukri was sheathed at his waist, the hilt worn smooth where his fingers had gripped it through endless deployments, through base camps and border patrols and those strange, classified missions that didn't make it to the reports. He slung his rifle, Enfenskar, nicknamed Kali for its matte black stock and the little red tilak scratched into the magazine well, over his shoulder. It was custom-fitted with an underbarrel grip, thermal scope, and a braided cord from his first para unit. The weapon was more than familiar, it was ritual now. And rituals, as Rana well knew, were sometimes all that stood between a man and madness. He clipped his military-grade torchlight, codenamed Tejas, to the shoulder loop of his jacket, activating its low-beam red mode. That beam could cut through jungle fog like a machete and reveal heat trails without bouncing back off mist or snow. Paired with his thermal headcam unit, a slim, war-toughened device known as Osprey, he could move like a ghost through terrain most men would call hell. The complex was quiet now. That brutal, howling wind that had screamed across the ridges had faded, either muffled by the snow-packed rock or simply choosing to leave. But that quiet was not peace. It was the sort of silence that had weight, depth. It felt like being underwater, like standing in the middle of a church no one prayed in anymore. And that's when he heard it again, the voices. Soft, like distant calls echoing from a valley bottom, words not quite Hindi, not Russian, not anything born from human tongue. Murmurs and syllables curling through the air like incense smoke, subtle, but cutting straight into the meat of his mind. Rana stiffened. His hand went to the kukri, instinct, not fear. His breathing slowed deliberately. He closed his eyes and listened. The voices were closer now. Rana stood, quietly, deliberately. He slid on his boots, tightened the straps of his jacket, and slung his thermal over his back. He didn't turn on his torch. No need. The tunnels were lit faintly by that dull emergency glow, and beyond the busted hatch, the snowfield had taken on a faint blue hue under the waning storm light. He stepped outside. The cold kissed his face immediately, but he didn't flinch. The wind was whispering across the jagged snowbanks, and deep in the folds of the valley, beyond the curve of the pine-dotted ridge, the whispers rose again, in cadence now. His boots crunched over the ice as he moved away from the hatch, past the jagged metal edge of the exploded door. He didn't go far, just to the top of the snowbank that overlooked the sloped gully they'd climbed through earlier that day. Rana didn't blink, didn't speak, but his pulse thudded behind his ears. The noises in his head, they weren't new. They never truly stopped. Not since that assignment near the Gobi perimeter. That cryptid, half king, half human, with eyes that knew too much. Ever since then, he'd needed the pills. The sleep meds, he kept them buried at the bottom of his rucksack. Never more than a week's supply. Never admitting how badly he depended on them. The military didn't like weakness. The cryptid unit didn't allow it. But the truth was, he was cracked inside, but cracked, like stained glass still holding its shape. And the cracks had names: childhood, family, the banyan tree. He remembered it more clearly than his own birth date, for bodies swinging gently in the breeze, ropes creaking above them, eyes open, skin drained of color, and a smell like wet ash and guilt. His mother, his sister, his father, half dressed in his railway uniform. His little brother, the one who always begged Rana to stop chasing ghosts, to stop sneaking into ruins with candles and camcorders. He had thought it was fun. Back then, teenage nights spent hopping walls, trespassing abandoned asylums, drawing salt rings, reciting mantras he barely understood, looking for demons. And one had answered. No one ever found the culprit, or a reason, but Rana knew. And he never was the same again. Then he got selected into the Indian Army, easy recruitment due to ex-servicemen quota. It had saved him, not from ghosts, but from himself. It had given him rules, routines, orders. And later, it had given him a folder with no insignia and a flight to Mizoram, where he learned that India had its own monsters, and they wore faces no demonologist had written about. He became their best tracker, the one who didn't flinch. But here, tonight, standing outside a dead Soviet ruin with whispers threading into his brain, he didn't feel strong. He felt watched. He looked back at the entrance. Should he wake Parth or Chow or all of them? His fingers twitched toward the hatch. But something stopped him. A sense that if he turned his back on the ridge now, whatever was watching would follow him inside. Would take one of them. Or worse, enter through them. His hand went to his kukri. Unsheathed it just slightly. Rana didn't rush. He moved in slow, deliberate paces, each step quiet but certain, pausing at every third movement to scan the environment with the torch in his eyes. He moved beyond the damaged steel entry of the Burzil complex, crouching to slide beneath the twisted rebar and melted hinges where they had blasted through hours before. Outside, the wind had dropped to a hiss, but the cold remained, deep, crawling cold that didn't just settle on the skin but burrowed into joints and wrapped fingers around your spine like it wanted to pull your bones out through your teeth. The stars were hidden behind a veil of cloud, and the mountains, once grand and distant, now stood around him like dead titans watching from afar. The mission wasn't clear. It never had been. The debrief at base had been vague. Investigate heat signatures, determine source of anomalies, record and report. There had been talk of old Soviet installations, maybe biological warfare remnants, maybe geothermal shifts. No one used the words cryptid or entity or apex predator. But Rana had seen the signs. He had seen this before. In Turkey, in the mangroves of Bengal, even once on a border village in Arunachal where the villagers never came out during a full moon and left their livestock tied in sacrificial patterns. This wasn't reconnaissance. Not really, it was containment or cleanup. And Rana didn't like the odds. He paused, knelt, and took a breath. His hand touched the snow. It was sticky red. There, 10 meters ahead, just beyond the slope of the ridge that curled behind the back of the research facility like a spinal deformity, was a patch of snow-stained dark. Not crimson, not bright, but old blood, dried, refrozen. Not the kind that poured from a cut. His senses flared. The same way they had near the banyan tree. The same deep, electric tug in his chest that told him something sacred had been desecrated here. He moved closer. The tracks weren't fresh. The snow was too disturbed. But there was movement in the patterns. Something had dragged a body. The indentations were too wide. More like a creature that had stumbled or limped. The blood continued, blotches of it, like breadcrumbs, stretching into the narrow corridor between two shale ridges. He followed. The memories came to him again, like an instinct before a great danger. The banyan tree. For ropes, for shadows, the look on the local constable's face when he'd cut down Rana's little brother, whose neck had snapped so cleanly it looked like the work of a professional. This is what happens when you play with things you don't understand, the inspector had muttered. But Rana had understood. He knew the warning signs. The salt that failed to hold. The scratch marks on the walls. The unnatural silence the night before. The fact that their pet parrot had died a week earlier, feathers plucked from its own body. So when the government picked him years later from his service in the army, when some black-suited bureaucrat from a division he couldn't name asked him to join a team that specialized in environmental anomalies of undisclosed origin, he hadn't hesitated. Not because he was brave, because he wanted answers. The blood trail deepened. Visibility dropped as the wind kicked up again. Snowflakes fat as bottle caps spiraling in unpredictable directions, catching the beam from Tejas and turning it into a strobe. He switched to pulse mode. The red hue beat like a pulse from his chest outward. Then, he froze, he saw a footprint. Not human, not bear, something wider. The snow compressed 6 inches deep. The width of the print was nearly 10 inches. And it wasn't alone. He lowered himself, rifle ready. Kali hummed against his glove. The scope flickered, caught on something, a heat signature. Faint, distant. He dared not follow yet. The trail would take him too far from the complex. Too far from his team. If he got lost out here, or worse, captured, it would mean a delayed extraction or no extraction at all. And he couldn't risk that. He was their only cryptid tracker. And the only one who had truly believed from the beginning that they were not alone. The wind moaned behind him. He turned, and for a long moment, he couldn't see the complex at all, only snow, mountain, and shadow. Then barely the outline. A slanted metal shape against the cliff base. A faint blue flicker from the emergency lamp above the hatch. The rest of it? Swallowed by storm and night. He exhaled, tapped the side of his Osprey cam to tag the location and terrain. This trail was real. This thing had bled. Whatever the Soviets had locked away, whatever the Americans had killed in Kandahar, whatever force the Himalayas still remembered, It was still walking. Rana turned back, one last glance at the blood in the snow. The complex disappeared by then. The wind behind him died in a hush, and the silence that followed was no mercy. It was the silence of a predator's pause, the moment when the forest, the mountain, the snowdrift all seemed to lean in to listen. Rana's boots, half buried in powder and edged in rime frost, moved like a chess piece on a cursed board. His rifle, Kali, was slung against his shoulder with care, the muzzle tilted slightly downward, not out of laziness, but intention. He didn't want to spook whatever was watching, because something was watching. His Osprey cam lens flickered once, then again, and there, like a ghost skipping frames in a video feed, a blur of movement shot from one ridgeline to another. Just a flicker of motion, a twitch, but not a blur caused by machine lag or snow distortion. This was a presence, a creature, fast and uneven. Rana's breath steadied. He shifted his steps, off the trail now, crouching behind a low pine tree twisted by wind and decades of winter. It was the kind of cover that didn't stop bullets, didn't fool thermal optics, but it broke silhouettes. And in the wild, that sometimes meant survival. With one gloved hand, he drew his kukri from its leather sheath, its blade dull in the low light but still humming with memory. Every 30 paces or so, he scored the bark of a pine tree, not lazily or randomly, but practice slashes that cut just deep enough to leave scars the snow couldn't erase. A crescent followed by a cross. His old sign from the old trails. The markings glowed faintly in his torchlight as he moved farther from the complex. The deeper he walked, the less real things felt, like the snow was fabric, the trees cardboard, and the wind a whisper through speakers hidden behind the stage. And still, the complex, once visible just behind him like a brooding bunker, was now swallowed by the white. Gone, he looked back. Nothing, not even the glint of frost-off Soviet steel. For heaven's sake, the memory of the banyan tree slammed into him then, as if it had been waiting all night for just this moment. The gnarled branches, the swollen roots, the sound of the rope creaking, and the eyes, all 4 pairs, glassy and swinging in the still air. His mother's face had been strangled into something unrecognizable, but it was her sari that gave her away. Orange with the golden border. That image never left. His legs slowed slightly, but the red in the snow up ahead spurred him forward. He didn't run. Running in this terrain was suicide. Instead, he moved low and forward, letting his boots sink just enough to keep him grounded, his military-grade torch by the unit, slicing the darkness like a scythe through fog. Then it happened. The creature didn't vanish. It reappeared. Rana caught the silhouette again. Not sprinting, not fleeing, but now looming just beyond the edge of the torch's throw. As though it had circled back. As though it was done giving him warnings. And now it watched from only a few meters away. Towering above, massive shoulders cloaked in mats of snow and what looked like rotting hide. Steam pulsed from its chest with each exhale, slow and deliberate. Its breath alone warped the snowflakes around it, pushing them aside like a god parting smoke. It had followed him, and this time it hadn't stepped back. Rana, one hand still wrapped around Kali, another on the kukri, crouched low, cautioned, like he knew this would happen all along. The sentinel hadn't come to warn. It had come to judge. And judgment, when it falls from the hands of giants, is never clean. It is bone-snapping, it is memory-erasing. It is the kind of thing that makes your ancestors turn in their graves, whispering apologies for passing their blood down to you. In a breath no longer than a half-second and yet stretched like time itself was stalling to witness the reckoning, the creature extended its grotesque hands, massive, elongated, with digits thick as crowbars and nails like yellow talons, cracked and crusted with something that once resembled blood. Whether it intended to crush, to rip, to eat, or to simply end the little man standing before it, only it knew. But Rana knew motion, and that's what counted. His body dropped to the right in a roll, his knees bending instinctively, spine twisting just enough so the hulking swipe missed his ribcage by a hair. Snow exploded behind him like shrapnel from a bomb. And then, his finger found the trigger. Kali, loyal and cold in his hands, erupted. The Scar rifle, heavily modified for sub-zero operations, belched fire and fury into the winter night. A burst setting, 3 rounds per breath, 5.56 by 45 millimeters NATO standard. Only these rounds weren't standard. They were tipped with frangible cores, designed to break apart inside the target, shredding flesh, shattering bone, causing maximum trauma. Rana had prepped them himself back in labeled them with red Sharpie. 1 round at the heart, 2 for the lungs. The muzzle flash lit up the clearing in bursts, 1, 2, 3, like lightning struck by human hands. The bullets punched through the curtain of snowfall, a chorus of sound and fury slicing toward the abomination's upper body. The thing screamed, it screamed like a man in agony, a man who had forgotten what language was and so returned to the root of all pain. A howl of fury so raw it made Rana's eardrums ring. And in that moment, something inside Rana's brain screamed too, not from fear, but because he knew the shots hit. He knew they had found purchase in something vital. Yet the beast didn't fall. It buckled. First to its knees, arms bent, fingers clutching at the snow as if trying to grip reality itself. Then, impossibly, it jumped. One moment it was down. The next, it was airborne. It soared like a shadow, but its trajectory wasn't wild. It was calculated. It knew where Rana was. And it landed exactly there, exactly there. Rana moved fast. He slid on his side, boot heels kicking against the ice, and narrowly dodged the cratered impact zone where the beast had landed. Snow sprayed up around him like ocean foam. Kali spun in his grasp, and more rounds flew. A last gasp, a burst into the ribs, the neck, the head, anything. But he knew better now. This wasn't a target. This wasn't a cryptid. This was something ancient, pre-human, a living relic of a time when judgment wasn't measured in morality but in might. Rana fought with all his might, emptying the last of the magazine. His fingers moved on instinct, ejecting the smoking clip and slamming in another with the speed of a man who had counted his last heartbeats before. But the creature didn't falter. It closed the gap again, leaping, almost casually, back to within a meter of him. This time, Rana screamed, a full-chested, furious cry that was part war cry, part human defiance, part admission that he was done running, that he'd bled for this war too long, that if he was going to die here, it would be standing. The beast swung, a wide, sweeping blow from its right arm, a move meant to kill, instant kill, a blow from that monster of an arm, meant death. It's not like the movies where the hero survives even the worst of attacks. There was no chance of error in real encounters. Rana ducked, no hesitation, no thought, just instinct. His left hand left Kali. His right pulled the kukri free. The blade sliced through, it wanted violence. He thrust, hard, fast, into the midsection. The kukri met something, not flesh, not bone or armor. Something in between. It struck with a thunk that echoed in Rana's spine, vibrating through his knuckles and his teeth. It was like jamming a machete into petrified wood soaked in blood. The thing staggered. Rana didn't pull the blade out. He shoved it deeper. Another arm squeezed the third clip Rana loaded in the heat of that moment, and seconds later, the rifle burst ended with the sound of just empty trigger pulls, hot air from the barrel, and on the other end, a huge gape in the midsection where Rana struck the creature. It screamed again, this time less like a man, more like a memory being torn apart, like a soul rupturing through vocal cords. Its hands flailed, catching only air. The air around them distorted, temperature dropping, snow falling faster, as if the valley itself wanted to bury this moment in white. Rana wrenched the blade free. Dark blood, black, sludgy, and steaming, gushed from the wound. It smelled of something primordial. Not death. Before death. A stench like the first sins ever committed by life. The beast dropped to one knee. Rana stood over it, kukri in hand, rifle slung to the side, body bruised but blood still hot. His chest heaved, and now, bleeding, broken, it was judging still. Eyes like carved holes stared up at him, not with fear, not even with hate. In that fleeting, breath-snatching moment of calm after the fury, Rana noticed something out of place. An angular shape in the snow several meters away, nestled where the powder had been freshly kicked and blood had splattered in shallow arcs. His eyes squinted against the wind that hissed through the valley like a serpent, and it clicked almost instantly. His camera. The Osprey military-grade helmet cam, rigged for low light and thermal vision, had somehow been flung during his clash with the Sentinel, tossed like a ragdoll amidst chaos. He lunged for it with a grunt, scooping it up with one hand, and with fingers numb and clumsy from the cold, he jammed his thumb against the playback toggle, eyes darting to the flickering screen. There was every frame, clear as the day he no longer believed in. The creature, the contact, the impossible stature, the blood, the kukri strike, all of it. "Fuck, this is solid evidence," Rana muttered under his breath, the word barely escaping his cracked lips like a confession to the night. The data was intact. The evidence had been secured. The mission, at least what he believed it to be, was now technically complete. He approved. He had seen the myth bleed. He had survived the judgment, however temporarily. There was no reason, none at all, to play the hero anymore. This wasn't a story that needed a martyr. It needed a messenger. Turning with the urgency of a man who had just escaped the jaws of an ancient god, Rana started moving. No, not just moving, running. His boots slammed into the snow with uneven rhythm, crunching and slipping across frozen slush and ice-crusted ground, each step screaming agony. Pain suddenly bloomed like wildfire up his left leg, sharp and bright and unforgiving, and his teeth clenched around the taste of blood as he realized something deep inside, something tendon or ligament or maybe even bone, had been torn or cracked in the skirmish. But there was no time to diagnose. It didn't matter, because he ran. Ran as if the thing behind him had returned to finish what it started, because maybe it had. His instincts, honed from decades of chasing things that only blinked into view when they wanted to be seen, were now blaring in the back of his skull like klaxons from a submarine going under. Something was following him. He didn't have to look. Didn't want to. That ancient, primal nerve just beneath the base of the spine. The one that evolution whispered into with secrets of predators long extinct, was now firing like a storm. He could feel it. Something immense, something that didn't run like a man but like a mass, a force of motion and weight and hunger. And then it came, the sound. A scream, deep and ragged and stitched together from every dying thing the world had forgotten. It tore through the white silence of the valley like a god's tantrum, a roar layered with centuries of buried wrath. A sound that didn't just reach his ears. It filled them, nested inside his skull, and made his knees buckle mid-stride for half a heartbeat. But he didn't fall. No, he couldn't fall. His legs, despite the fire eating through the tendons, kept going one after the other, as if they belonged to someone younger, someone less haunted, someone who hadn't watched his family hang from the branches of a banyan tree under a monsoon sky years ago. And still, behind him, the scream persisted, less a sound now and more a presence, like being chased by a memory that never wanted to be forgotten. He didn't turn to look. He knew it was there. Every few seconds, he felt it again, that pulse of pressure in the air, that thunder of feet too large to belong to any creature from this earth, the sound of snow being flung, of breath so heavy and hot it could melt frost in midair. It was pacing him, matching him, teasing him. It could have caught him by now. He was sure of it, but it hadn't. And when the ground dipped slightly, turning into a narrow corridor of packed snow between two old ice shelves, Rana's feet faltered again. The pain in his ankle intensified until stars burst in his vision with every step, but the osprey cam was still clutched to his chest, tucked under one arm like a newborn that carried the gospel of his survival. He knew the direction, back to the Soviet facility, where the others lay asleep or, at best, unaware. The wind howled like a mocking choir above the ridge as the faintest trace of artificial warmth brushed his face. A reminder of the old solar-powered heater they'd set up near the main bay doors of the Burzil complex. He was close, so fucking close. But the storm around him had grown wild, slashing into his exposed skin with needles of snow and hail. He pushed through it like a soldier on his final breath, boots kicking up white dust with every laboring step. Behind him, the roars, mad and furious. He just ran, head bowed, shoulders hunched, arms swinging with mechanical desperation, heart pounding like it might explode. He prayed, not in words, but in the primitive language of pulse and motion and refusal to die. And as the outer wall of the facility finally came into view through the white haze, Rana let out a noise somewhere between a sob and a growl. Because he knew something most men never learn until it's too late. That survival isn't about who's fastest. It's about who refuses to stop. And he would not stop. And just as his vision was beginning to blur, white noise in his ears, pain spiking behind his eyes, lungs collapsing in on themselves like folded tents, he saw it. The light, aglow, brighter than it had been before. The Soviet complex, partially buried but alive with light, now pulsating as if the mountain itself had stirred to his return. The orange glow of firelight mixed with the artificial flicker of emergency LED torches they'd strung up the night before, and it seemed impossibly far away yet close enough to make him want to scream. And then the pine tree fell. Or maybe it didn't fall, it was thrown. A massive branch, thick as a lamppost and nearly 20 feet in length, whipped through the storm and landed directly in front of him with a sickening crack, snow and bark exploding in every direction like a roadside bomb had gone off. He screamed something, he didn't know what, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer, and dove to the side, his camera still clutched to his chest, eyes wide with the unrelenting focus of a man who had accepted that there was no heaven, only the cold and what lived inside it. His legs pushed again. This wasn't running anymore. It was violent escape. It was instinct given muscle and sinew and broken joints and screaming lungs. He charged the final meters with everything left in his tank, and just as his breath finally broke free in a strangled gasp, just as the howl behind him took on a new, guttural tone that sounded like death arriving in person, he collapsed. Right in front of the reinforced door. Flat into the snow. But still holding the cam. Still clutching that blinking red light like a lifeline. And then hands, arms, fingers, his team. They dragged him in. Chow's voice was the first to break the silence, loud and angry and scared all at once. Get him inside. Jesus Christ, what the fuck happened out there? Harjot was already at the door, gun leveled behind Rana, sweeping for movement. Tariq had a flare gun out, eyes darting through the falling snow, searching for shapes that shouldn't be there. Parth was yelling but not out of panic. He was yelling medical codes, orders, commands, already assessing Rana's breathing and pulse. They had all woken up. None of them had slept easy that night. They had heard the roars too, the deep, echoing ones. The primal bellows that didn't just vibrate the walls, but bent the air to announce war. Rana choked out words, mouth tasting blood and ice. Cam, everything's there. We have proof. He barely got the sentence out before his head lolled back. Parth caught him and propped his body against the old lab wall, his gloved hands already tearing through a trauma kit, prepping a salt pack and a heated 4. You're a madman, Chow muttered, kneeling beside him, patting down his jacket and checking his ribs. You stupid, lucky, brilliant bastard. Rana didn't respond, he couldn't, but the flicker of a smile crossed his cracked lips. The door behind them was jammed with all heavy metal and bones and plates they could ram into to keep it shut. Outside, the blizzard screamed on. And the second half of the encounter, the real truth of the giants and their deep connection to the mountain ranges, was just beginning. If you liked today's episode, do consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a lot. Thank you very much.